Buenas tardes, doña Thelma. Para mí es un placer y un honor estar aquí en su residencia en la ciudad de Nueva York para hacerle una entrevista relacionada a la situación y al trabajo que está realizado en favor de Puerto Rico en las Naciones Unidas en representación del Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, Movimiento Libertador. Mi nombre es José Castillo Morales, soy el vicepresidente del Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico.
Well, I first became aware of the problems of Don Pedro when I was a graduate student at Columbia University. We heard via some organizations, now I don't remember which organization, but it could have been the American Civil Liberties Union, and it could have been the War Resisters League, or those so-called liberal organizations. They said that there was a microphone installed in the bedroom in the hospital, Columbus Hospital, on, I think it's East 17th Street. And various people, you know, such as Roger Baldwin from the American Civil Liberties Union, went and they read statements that they had prepared, which were read into the microphone. So I found out about the microphone in this hospital, which was run by Italian nuns. So I decided to go there one day, and at the desk they gave me Don Pedro's room number, and I went in, I knocked on the door, and I went, he said, come in. He was sitting there reading the New York Times. So I told him, I introduced myself and said I had come to see the microphone. And he said the microphone had left about 2 days before in the briefcase of Vito Marcantonio, who was a congressman at that time. And he said Marcantonio had taken the microphone in his briefcase back to his office in Washington and put it in his safe. Now that was the first that I heard. It was, you know, a violation of civil liberties. That was the first I had heard of it. And of course, when I met Albizu, I found out that, you know, he had a bachelor's degree and a law degree from Harvard, and the guy was quite an easy person to talk to.
He was in very bad condition at that time.
Yeah, he had a heart condition. And he was, you know, he wasn't, I'm not a medical person, so I really don't know, but I know he had a heart condition, which is why he was in the hospital. His doctor was an Italian, a heart specialist. His name was Secondari. Because I remember after Don Pedro had left the hospital, he asked me one day whether I would take him up to his doctor's. So, you know, I went and picked him up and got in a taxi cab and went out.
When he can able to talk in that time,
Who?
Don Pedro?
Oh, yeah. He was here in New York for some years.
In what year, do you remember what year was that? Don't remember.
Well, you must have a record of when you went back to Puerto Rico. That you probably have that as a record.
Okay.
Now you mentioned, you know, maybe 3 years or so before that.
Okay.
He went back by boat because his doctor didn't want him to fly because of his heart condition. Yeah, well, we're learning these days that all kinds of things go on. I mean, in our contemporary society.
You think that the persecution in that moment when he was very, very, very bad. He was in a jail a lot of years, and
yeah, he was in Atlanta.
Do you went to see him in the jail when he was?
No, I didn't know. I didn't know about it. The first I heard about it was when he was in a Columbus hospital when they introduced the microphone. You see, that's when I found out about it. I had no idea who was there. But this was a microphone, and we learned by way of American Civil Liberties Union or other liberal organizations, that the government had installed a microphone. And when I talked to him about it, he said that a couple of men had come into his room and they said that they were electricians and they had to repair something. So he said he didn't really pay any attention to them. But just before they left, they went and tested it. And of course the microphone went bing bing when they touched it. And he said if they hadn't done that, he wouldn't have been even aware of it. So of course the first thing he did was to call the hospital staff.
And the hospital staff looked into the work that the electricians, so-called electricians, had done?
They had seen it,
and they discovered the microphone?
No, Albizu discovered the microphone.
Oh. And the hospital staff confirmed?
They went he said they went ding ding, they tested it to make sure it was working. Because he said he wasn't paying any attention to them. They said they were electricians and they had come to repair something. So what they did was they wanted to make sure it worked, so they did, they tested it. And when it went bing bing, then he realized it was a microphone. And so that's the point at which he called the administration of the hospital.
What did they do? Did they take out the microphone from where it was? Or?
No, they took it out. Vito Marcantonio was a congressman from, I think, El Barrio.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And he took the microphone and put it in his briefcase and took it back to Washington. He took good care of it. He put it in his safe in the House of Representatives.
That's the evidence.
Yeah.
Naciones Unidas.
Well, you see, when the United Nations we first heard about the UN, I think the first meeting was in San Francisco. And then, of course, the charter came out. And you could read the charter, and I read through the charter. And Don Pedro was in Columbus Hospital, and I read through the charter, and I said to him, look, under this thing, non-self-governing territories, I said, you have a right to appeal for membership. And he said to me, are you sure? I said, look, let's read it, and we just read the text. And I said, you have a right to appeal for membership. And he was a little bit on the doubtful side. So I said, look, I'll go drop by the United Nations and ask for the filing documents. So I went over there and got a pile of documents, and I, gave it to him. And I said to him, according to this, the Nationalist Party qualifies as a non-self-governing territory under the Trusteeship Council. And I said, you could apply as under non-governmental agencies. So I said, you have a whole bunch of things to fill out. So, what's the name of the party, the address, who's the president, do you have a council, what are the members of the council, do you have membership meetings, how often do you, it was just detailed, how often do you have membership meetings, and, that sort of data. So he filled all of that stuff out and gave it to me, and I handed it back into the United Nations. And I got a pack of data to saying what the organization had to do. And Don Pedro by then was in Puerto Rico. So I sent this stuff to him, and I said, now that you've got this credential, I said, you have to explain it. So he called a press conference, and he explained how the United Nations operated, and this was all detailed. And among the fun things that happened is the United Nations put out film strips, and they had a picture of Don Pedro. Now this is something they circulated all over, all over the UN, of different people explaining what the United Nations was. And this was a picture of Don Pedro explaining what the United Nations was, what the charter was, the different elements of the charter, and how Puerto Rico had applied to be in the non-self-governing territories as an organization. Well, he was quite ill in Puerto Rico and San Juan. And I went there with Ruth Miller. And he was really quite ill at that time.
Did you meet Ruth Reynolds too?
Oh yeah, I knew Ruth Reynolds. Ruth Reynolds and I were members of some of the same anti-war groups, so that I knew Ruth for a long time.
And you went to Puerto Rico on that time to see him in the hospital. Presbyteriano was, I think, was the hospital that was in, right? When the last time that...
No, he was at home.
At home?
No, he wasn't. He was at, I think, at party headquarters.
Uh-huh.
In the middle of San Juan.
En Palmeras, Santurce.
No, not in Santurce.
Rio Piedras.
No. I think it was right in San Juan.
En San Juan.
I remember the old buildings, they had doors, because I had been walking around the street one day, and it was very hot and humid. And I stopped by there and I said to him, "Oh, the weather has changed." I said, "There's really almost an icy breeze going out." And there must have been some meeting had just broken up. And all of a sudden, all these men flew ran down the steps and out into the street. And I said to him, "What was this other rapid exit?" He said, "You've just announced there's going to be a bad storm." So I said to him, "Oh, I'll go back to the hotel." And he said, "No, you better not. You better stay here." And right away they closed those, the doors that are in front of the windows. There was, those huge wooden doors. And then he took a chair over in one corner. It's where where one wall, it would be an inner wall, and he took a chair over there. He said, "You sit over there."
That was in Calle Luna and Calle Sol in San Juan.
In San Juan.
In Viejo San Juan.
Yeah.
When Don Pedro lived there and was the office of the Nationalista.
Yeah.
You said you were the representative of the Nationalist Party at the UN?
Yeah, half a century ago.
What kind of information or what kind of things did you present to United Nations?
Well, all I could present was I could only present, via the agents, the office there, which had non-governmental agencies. In other words, everything I did, I had to go through the non-governmental agencies. And then at the time the revolution broke out in Puerto Rico, I just sat down at my typewriter and I typed up a statement. And I have since seen a copy. I don't have a copy of it, but I have since seen a statement of that. And I didn't even do any thinking. I just put the paper, the typing paper, and I just typed right off and ripped it out and and left.
This is the
And
revolt of
it's a
1950?
and it's a very good statement for somebody who did it that fast. Read the statement. And I took it over there and I talked with two men. There was a breach of the peace. There's a breach of the peace, and at that point, the United Nations should interview where there was a breach of the peace. So I went over there and I talked with two men, and then, I don't know, several days later, the credentials were canceled.
The period that you're referring to, the revolt, is of 1950, that began in Jayuya.
Yeah, the one that started in Jayuya, yeah. I knew most of those people, Blanca Canales and...
You had met with them?
Oh yeah, I knew them.
Here or in Puerto Rico?
In Puerto Rico.
Really? Do you remember
Manolin. What was his last name?
Negron.
Manolin Negron. Yeah, and Medina Ramirez.
Ramon Medina.
Yeah. And...
Ramon Medina era de Isabela.
Oh yeah, Isabella Ranton, yeah. I think she was in Mexico when Don Pedro went back to Puerto Rico. I think she was working in Mexico, and she went back to Puerto Rico because he did.
Do you remember any conversations or interaction with Blanca Canales? What was she like?
Oh, she was very pleasant. The very first time she took me to Hialeah, she told me that the trip there was going to be difficult because, you know, it's up like this.
It's winding roads and around the mountain.
Winding roads. And I said, that's all right.
Still like that?
Yeah, of course.